Dr. Odell is the CEO of LifeQuest Training and Consulting, and as an expert in ADA, she has helped dozens of property owners by evaluating their properties and writing comprehensive transition plans to help them meet the requirements of the ADA. We want you to come watch and learn as she empowers and tells us what we need to know. So I also want to point out Leah Paul from the city and Warren as well from the city. Can you two stand up, please? These are also our city contacts because the city has been very, very proactive in this and helping to educate you. And they are the ones who introduced us to Dr. Odell. So please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Odell.
So it's fantastic to be here. Can you guys all hear me okay? Okay, so a couple things is, number one, if at any point you can't hear me, just please feel free to let me know. Second thing is, if I get to talking too fast, I want you guys to do this. I'm going to teach you a sign, okay? I want you to do this sign right here. So you're going to take your right hand, you're going to take it at your left fingers, and you come up. And this is the sign for slow down, because I'm on 5.5 hours of sleep, massive adrenaline, and caffeine. So I'm just going to warn you right now that I do tend to talk a little fast sometimes, okay? Especially because we have an awful lot to talk about. So hopefully here, all technology is going to work beautifully. There we go. Okay. The reason why we're talking about this is because the ADA is a civil rights law. A lot of people don't realize this, but truly a civil rights law that affects building code. People with disabilities make up the fastest growing minority population in the world. If you look right here, by the year 2030, which is just seems like it's right around the corner, we're looking at 71.5 million baby boomers who will be over the age of 65. Accessibility attracts not only people with disabilities, but of course also their families. And then the bottom line here that everybody cares about is this group has about $175 billion in discretionary spending power. Now, I talk to a lot of people, and a lot of people go, what's discretionary spending power? That's sort of like the extra money at the end of the month, which is why most people don't know exactly what discretionary spending power is. But essentially, we're talking about a civil rights law that affects the fastest growing minority population in the world. And because it is a law, that means obviously there is litigation that can happen. And so we want to make sure that we kind of get everybody prepared. The Department of Justice talks about readily achievable barrier removal. And they list 4 specific priorities. So accessible approach and entrance, access to goods and services, access to restrooms, and then any other measures necessary. And we're going to focus on all of those, but we're going to focus a little bit more on the parking lot specifically. Now, unfortunately, if you stub your toe, you may get a doctor's note and be able to get a parking placard or plate for accessible parking. Now, I'm going to stop right there real quick and say the word accessible is the term that we're going to use. The word handicap, I know a lot of people still use it, but it's actually not politically correct. And this isn't a whole big class on PC terminology, but I do want to point that out. We're talking about accessible entrances, accessible parking. And in this particular case, we're talking about a placard for accessible parking. And again, it's so easy to get, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing more and more issues with there not being necessarily enough parking spaces. Even when there is technically enough, in many cases, the demand is just greater than the supply. The Department of Justice gives a specific scope, and the scope essentially means this is what you need to have as a minimum. And I say a minimum because you are always more than welcome to have more than that. The places I've worked, we typically will have literally twice the amount of accessible parking that is required by the Department of Justice because this population is growing so fast. The lawsuits that we've been seeing, or the warning letters, okay? And I don't know if you guys are aware that the scope of this, but there's one organization, for example, and there's many organizations, law firms that are doing this, but one in particular has announced that they have sent out 42,000 warning letters. 42,000 throughout Maricopa County, okay? So that's just one, and I'm not saying that's the only one. There's other places also. But what I will tell you is that I have seen many of these lawsuits, and they almost all primarily focus on these 3 issues, which is one of the reasons I want to talk about these specifically. They talk about the scope, which is, again, do you have the right number of spaces? They talk about signage, and they also talk about dispersion. So we're going to get into more details on these. So in terms of scope, again, this is what the requirement shows. So for example, if you have 1 to 25 spaces, you need to have 1 accessible space. 26 to 50, you need to have 2. Now, one of the differences between the 1991 standards for accessible design and the 2010 was it used to be for every 8 accessible spaces you had, one had to be a van accessible space. And the law now says for every 6 that you have to have one van accessible space. And then there becomes all these questions. Well, our building was built in 1975, so first off, we're grandfathered in, aren't we, overall? That's not the case at all. And so please, please hear me when I say this. There is no grandfather clause. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about a safe harbor piece, but I'm going to show you a little bit more about that. I think the main thing I want you to do is recognize that the laws did change specifically in relation to this. Now, the safe harbor that people kind of confuse with sort of this grandfathering is, I'm going to kind of read it here so I make sure you're really clear. The 2010 standards regulations include a safe harbor for features that already comply with the 1991 standards but may not meet the 2010 standards. Here's the example I want you guys to know. A retail store's parking lot has a total of 250 parking spaces in compliance with the 1991 standards, which is 1 in every 8 spaces, right? The lot includes 7 accessible spaces, 1 of which is van accessible. That would have been compliant with the 91 standards. The 2010 standards would require 2 van accessible spaces, but the store does not have to modify its parking lot to provide the additional space until the lot undergoes a planned alteration, such as restriping, resurfacing, etc., and that was after March 15th, 2010 or 2012, okay? If the lot is altered after that time, it will then be brought into compliance with the 2010 standards to the maximum extent feasible. So the question is how many parking lots have gone through any kind of restriping since March 15th, 2012? Well, we're looking at over 4 years ago, and this is Arizona, and the sun kind of beats down on these things. So it's very likely that you have. But here's what I'm going to recommend. Let's take a look at all this, and then my recommendation is go out and take a look overall at your parking spaces. And if you find that there's any kind of problems, and I will tell you that every single lawsuit we've been called out to, there has been grounds for complaint. There truly has been. We have not found one single one that we went out and said, we didn't find anything wrong at all. I don't know what you guys are talking about. Every single time we find not just one thing, we find multiple things. So we want to kind of get into that a little bit more. Another common complaint is the signage. Now, some people argue that if the bottom of the sign is not at 60 inches, is it really a problem? Like, what if it's 58 inches? And in some cases, that's what they found. It was 58, it was 59 inches, but it wasn't 60 inches. And if it's 59 3/4 of an inch, it's not compliant. Technically, it's not. And I know that seems so very picky, but the standards say 60 inches minimum, okay? So we want to really encourage you guys to take that at least as a minimum. But one of the things that I'm going to suggest is I'm going to suggest that you actually consider 80 inches. Now, we're talking 20 whole inches more than what the requirement is, but here's the reason why. Number one, there seems to be a little bit of a dispute as to 60 inches from what? 60 inches from the actual parking lot? Or 60 inches from maybe the sidewalk where the sign is actually in place? So I go to a lot of ADA conferences, and I actually speak at these conferences. And I have friends with the Access Board and friends with the Department of Justice. And I've asked them. Now, the Access Board, by the way, they wrote the law. The Department of Justice enforces the law. So I've asked my friends at both the Access Board and the Department of Justice, is it 60 inches from the parking space or from where it's actually posted, which in some cases is the sidewalk? They said, it doesn't really say. So if they don't know exactly, then it makes it a little bit difficult. Now, some people, what they will say is, you have to be able to see it with a parked vehicle. Well, 60 inches, I'm 60 inches, okay? So if a vehicle is parked in front of me, you're probably not going to see me. So this is another reason why I would suggest this is a minimum. If you go beyond that to 80 inches, number one, there is no question at all that parking space and that parking sign is high enough. Would you agree? Also, in some cases, anything that is under 60 or under 80 inches is considered a protruding object. And we're not going to get into the whole thing about protruding objects, but if it's at 80 inches, then there's not even any question at all that it is not even a protruding object. So that's, again, that's my own personal recommendation, and you're more than welcome to do that. What I will tell you is what's not really negotiable is this 60 inches, okay? So in some cases, let's say that you already have a sign, and it's at 60 inches, but it's technically a van accessible space, but it doesn't say van accessible. You can actually take that sign off and put on a sign that says van accessible on it specifically. But if you've already got a good 60 inches, in some cases, you know, you can get the little sign that kind of comes just below. It's just the little narrow one. You can just add that on also. So whichever way you do it, you just need to make sure that if it's a van accessible space, we'll get into details, that it clearly marks van accessible. Now, there's a little bit of controversy right now over what we used to call like the old wheelchair guy, which is technically the international symbol of accessibility, and what we now call the cool wheelchair dude, or I do anyways, the cool wheelchair dude. And the purpose of this, by the way, just a little quick history lesson, this guy is kind of sitting there waiting for someone to push him along, isn't he? Isn't that what he seems to be doing? Just sort of waiting for someone to push him along. People with disabilities, as a whole, do not like this sign, because they are not waiting for someone to come push them along. They're on the roll themselves, and they're quite active and doing a lot of great things. Paralympics, by the way, are coming up. And if you're not planning on watching it, I would really encourage you to check it out, because it is just as exciting, if not more exciting, I think, than the regular Olympics. Here's the thing, though, when it comes to this sign. This is technically what the Department of Justice says you need to have. Now, the Department of Justice does not say that you need to have that symbol on the concrete itself or on the space itself. Most everybody thinks that, and we all do it, and I want to encourage you to continue to do that. And if you want to put this cool guy out there, that's great. And by the way, it says a lot about your organization in terms of being proactive and kind of really being kind of in line with what people want. But this is the sign that really needs to technically be on the sign itself. That's the symbol. And I can't advise you otherwise. You can do what you want, and in some cases, the cities actually have ordinances that allow you to do something different. But for now, the Department of Justice says this is the sign that actually needs to be on the actual post, okay? Any questions about this so far?
Yeah, I have one question.
Please.
Concerning van accessibility.
Hang on 1 second.
Oh.
We want to have you speak into the mic because we are taping it so that people can hear it.
Thank you. One question I have concerning van accessibility or van accessible. You have one parking spot designated in accordance with the rules that are on the following page there within 25. Is there any rule that says how many of those spots have to be van accessible?
If you have 25 spaces total, you need to have one accessible space, and that one accessible space has to be van accessible. Has to be. You have to have a minimum of that. When we talk about dispersion, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about having more than that. Because if you need to be dispersed, then I want you to consider that each one of these little clusters of parking spaces needs to include a van accessible space. That's really your best option. That is going to stay right there. Yes?
Got a question about multiple tenant facilities.
Yes. We're going to get right there, because that's,
Okay.
I don't say it's exclusively what we deal with, but we see a lot of those. So we will absolutely talk about that in a moment. Another common complaint is signage. We already talked about that. By the way, this right here, that is not 60 inches. Or anywhere near 60 inches. I have no idea, not to mention the fact that it's in the access aisle. That is not where it belongs. You can see right here, I've given you kind of an example. There's the accessible space. In this particular case, it's van accessible. There's where the sign needs to be. There's your access aisle. And this gives you probably a pretty good description of exactly what you need to have. So you need to have, again, a minimum of one van accessible space. What they did here was they made one van with an access aisle that's shared with one standard accessible space. Another van, it's shared with another van or standard accessible space. This is pretty ideal in many cases, okay? You've got your van accessible sign right here, and then you have this, and this is something I'll bring up again in a minute, but I've been seeing more and more of these curb cuts actually as curb ramps into the access aisle, and that is not legal at all. It is not legal. And we have at least one company that they're having to rip out everything because an architect actually, I said, send me the plans. And the plans actually show the curb cut as a ramp down into the space. So I want to point out that even if the architect says this is what the law says, I want you guys to be empowered to go take a look at some of this stuff and take a look at this and really compare it. To be quite honest, and I know we're on live and this is recorded, so I'm going to be really careful, but please do not make any assumptions at all. You guys have heard what happens when you assume, right? I cannot stress this enough. Even if the architect says, no, it's okay to put that into the access aisle, it is not okay. Please call the Department of Justice yourself, okay? I've got some resources here. If you go to ada.gov, you've got a phone number. You can call them and ask them first. I will say another thing. No offense to any government at all, but I worked for government for 15 years. And I started inviting myself to go on the final inspections because we were finding problems within the city organizations or the cities that had just been passed inspection. And what I was finding was I was finding a lot of ADA things, like the final punch list. And I'm like, that sign's too high and this or this and that. Well, they stopped inviting me to go out because I was holding things up. But the fact is that in some cases, you know, consider that the entities that have to come out and do your final punch list, they have to consider all the safety features. They have to consider fire, electrical, and plumbing, and all these other things. And to be quite honest, in many cases, I can assure you architects are not getting enough training in ADA. So they're drawing the plans, and the inspectors have a lot to think about. And so I guarantee you, I have not been in one single building, not one building that I did not find problems. Brand new buildings, government buildings, just passed inspection, and I still found problems. In one particular case, they just opened, and I found a 28-inch door. By the way, it's supposed to be 32 inches wide at least at the opening, and it was 28 inches. So again, please make no assumptions whatsoever, and I realize that you're all going, oh my gosh, now what do we do? Because then who's responsible? Please, 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 again, don't make assumptions and take it into your own hands to call the Department of Justice. Okay, so we've kind of gone through, this is sort of the ideal, and then once again here, this is where the protruding objects comes out, the 4 inches. Once again, if you're at an 80-inch minimum, then you're probably not going to have many problems with that, okay? Here's some other things. What is the problem with this particular parking space? Anybody? There's a whole bunch of issues. But do you remember one thing that's really required? This access aisle. Do you know what that access aisle does? Essentially, when the person gets out of their vehicle, that gives them that space to come out in their mobility device. Now, the truth is you don't have to be in a mobility device to have one of those placards or plates. And so you may not actually be in a mobility device, but it still is required to have that because many people do need that. So we've seen this one before. Again, this has no access aisle whatsoever. So that's a concern. Sometimes you have spaces that are so wide, I don't know what in the world this is. This is one of the reasons why, even though the Department of Justice says, they used to say this more so, you could have an 8-foot space and an 8-foot access aisle. What happens to that 8-foot access aisle sometimes? People will park in that 8-foot access aisle, and then that person that's in that space cannot get back in or out of their vehicle because there's another person parked there. So I've seen this happen. The person parks, they get out, they go into whatever the event is, they come back out, they need to get back in their vehicle for sometimes they need to leave, or they have medical things that they need to do inside of their van, for example, and they physically cannot get back into their vehicle because someone pulled up into that 8-foot access space. We really encourage 5-foot access aisle, and you can use that 5-foot access aisle for a van space or a standard space. I actually took this picture right here. This was at a hotel up north, and this is their accessible parking. Now, what's one of the problems? There's no access aisle, and what is the other problem? It is being used as a little event stand. They use that area, so again, not okay. This is beautiful in my mind. This is like a dream come true. This is not. This is where we're going to get into dispersion. So we work with a lot of property management companies that own or represent strip malls in a sense. And so you could, for example, have entrances all through here. You can have, 4 different entrances at least here, 4 different entrances here. What's the concern? First and foremost, does anybody see an access aisle? No access aisle right there. And then the second thing is that this is great once it's compliant. It's great for the people that are right in here. But what about those who are down here or those who are down here? So I park, and then I have to come all the way down and around to enter into the building this way. This is where dispersion comes in, and this has, again, been one of the complaints, is they say there's not enough dispersion. Now, we've been at, there's one particular area we went to, and it had 4 offices, and it was a very small little area. And they had the accessible parking on one side that was real easy to get into the 2 of the offices. But there was truly no space over on this other side unless you went across the way and then you'd have to cut in through traffic to get to it. And it was such a small little complex that even if they had been able to put parking over here, they would have walked almost just as far as if they'd parked the other way. Does that make sense? So in some cases, you have a very small little office complex that doesn't have this type of dispersion. This isn't even that big. We've seen them where they're much bigger than this. And again, this is where that dispersion is important because you need to make sure that you have accessible entrances at these. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have 10 different retail spaces, you necessarily have to have 10 accessible parking spaces, 1 in front of each one. as much as possible, you want to try to combine these. So you would do, again, a van accessible space, the 5-foot access aisle, and a standard space, and every 2 to 3 offices, for example, could share that, as long as they're kind of centered. Does that make sense? So that's what we did encourage on this. This was a real case that we had. We encouraged them to add parking here and parking here, and obviously this they had to fix. So that's an example there. Now what I want to encourage you guys to do is I want to encourage you to go out into your parking lot and start measuring, truly. You can evaluate your scope. Take a look. How many parking spaces do you have? Take a look at the scope requirements I gave you. Do you have enough spaces as a minimum? The next thing is measure your signs. It's mind-boggling. You can go out and you can measure the sign, and if it is anything anywhere near that 60 inches, whether you're on the concrete or you're on the asphalt or you're actually on the concrete, please, please, please raise up your signs. And the next thing is evaluate dispersion. Here's all my spaces, but there's offices way down there and there's offices way down there. I may have the minimum number, but do I have enough to disperse them out? Does that make sense? So really want to encourage you guys to go and take a look at that. Now, I did this presentation or something very similar to it a few weeks ago as a webinar. And it was lawyers that had contracted with me to do this, and I had to do this disclaimer. So I'm going to give you guys this disclaimer too, because now it's kind of drilled into me. If you get a lawsuit, they may ask you for documentation of any efforts towards compliance. Okay? You do not have to write down. I'm encouraging you guys to go out to measure and to write it down and to evaluate it. Okay? But you do not have to write down or formally document your findings. However, you do have to be compliant. The concern that I had gotten from these lawyers was if they write it down, now they're more liable. But if they don't evaluate it and they go, we didn't know, ignorance is not going to be an excuse at all. It is absolutely not going to be an excuse. It's not defendable. So go out, measure it. I don't care if you write it on a piece of tissue paper and burn it, but measure it and evaluate where you're at and then start to make some changes, okay? If you document and do nothing, by the way, you are at greater risk. And if you don't document and you do nothing, you're at great risk. So either way, you need to do something. So here's what we suggest people do. You know what? If you Google your address into Google Maps, shoot, you can look straight down in on it. That's a really good way to see dispersion because it gives you sort of this overall picture, and then you can see, gosh, you know, we have parking right here, and we have all these other entrances. So this gives you a good overview. And then one of the things we would encourage you guys to do is do it yourself, but if you need some additional help, paste in the picture, and then maybe go outside and write down all of your measurements. And I'll show you an example of that. Write the information listed on the next few pages, which we'll show you, and then make sure everything is 100% accurate, and take pictures of everything that you find, okay? Count how many parking spaces you have total. I've given you this in 3 different particular cases. How many parking spaces, how many van accessible spaces. Write the data on each picture. So you can see what we did here. This is a space we'd up north somewhere. So you can see we indicated there was a total of 200 spaces. That was the inches. There was 57 spaces. There were 2 8A spaces. There was nothing that was van accessible. So you can see we Google mapped down in on this. We marked in where the spaces were, and then this is the recommendation that we had. They needed to have more spaces. This was the only accessible entrance to the accessible rooms. This was a hotel. So what we did was we said 3 ADA spaces with 1 van accessible space was our recommendation based on what they had. Now, the building is so close here that ideally you would have each one of these access aisles going directly to a curb ramp that goes up onto that space. But there was no space on this sidewalk at all. So what we recommended that they do was actually put almost like, kind of like an access aisle or a warning aisle behind these so someone can come out and then they could easily go up. And this was actually the compliant ramp that went up into the entrance. Does that make sense? Ideally, you have curb cuts at each one of these, but in some cases you don't. Yes?
Now, you just said that that's not included.
What's that?
The curb ramp on the access aisle. Right.
This isn't an access aisle right here.
No, but you just said that
It would extend right here. So this has to be flat, at essentially 2.08%. So this has to stay flat along with this, but right here, remember that first picture I showed you that I said that was an ideal picture? That's where the curb cut starts, right here, and it goes in towards the sidewalk.
I think there's some confusion over curb.
Not in the access aisle. I think so too. So a curb cut, let me see if I've got another picture. I do have, here's a perfect picture, okay? So here's your accessible space, here is your access aisle. This is the curb cut or the curb ramp. Same thing pretty much. Curb cut or curb ramp that goes up onto the sidewalk. In the particular case I just showed you, this sidewalk was so narrow, there was no way to do that.
Understood that, but in the beginning, you stipulated that that was not correct because of the architects. So explain that difference between the architect version that you
There.
started versus this.
Here's an example of one, where they actually, instead of the curb cut or curb ramp going from the access aisle up into the sidewalk, they essentially extended the sidewalk down into the access aisle. Does that make sense?
So bottom line, what you're saying is that the curb cut has to be in the sidewalk, not extended out into the roadway.
Right. Right. It cannot extend into the parking lot, and it cannot extend into the access aisle. And again, I apologize for any confusion on that. Absolutely. And you know what? Here's I love this picture. I just grabbed this off Google Maps, but you can see the reason why. The person's trying to get out of their vehicle, they're trying to get into their wheelchair, and there is a curb ramp that actually goes down into the access aisle. This is exactly the reason why you can't do this. Okay? Let me go back just a little bit. Okay, so we talked about this aspect of things. Again, in terms of your signs, please go out and take a look at your signs. Write the data down, however you want to do it, but make sure you raise those signs up. Again, in terms of dispersion, take a look at where the actual ADA spaces are at in comparison to all of your entrances, okay? If there's not enough spaces near your different entrances, add more. Now, are you going to add more than what the minimum scope requirement is? Probably so. If you're looking at, let's say you're looking at one building, it's a big building with lots of parking spaces, but it's really one business, and you have this main accessible entrance. You can have the minimum number if you want to. However, that's for one business. But if you have multiple businesses in this one big building, they need to have an accessible parking provided to them also. And that's where you're going to go above what the minimum is, because you also need to meet that dispersion requirement. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
Okay, so just to clarify, you're required to have the access aisle, but the access aisles must also have the curb cut.
If possible, if it is feasible, you are always required to have this access aisle, regardless.
Right.
The curb cut, hopefully, there is space in the sidewalk to bring the curb cut up in to the sidewalk. So a person gets out of their vehicle, they transfer onto here, they go up, and then they go over to the business, for example.
Right, but if there's not enough width, you have to provide a ramp someplace else nearby.
You still need to have an accessible path from the
Right.
from the parking lot up to it. But in some cases, it may end up being, like in this case, the only place they already had, this was a ramp that went all the way down, and it was a real gradual, long ramp that went down. This was the only way to get into the hotel lobby right here. There was literally not enough sidewalk. So we had no choice but to recommend that they come down, they go over, and then they come up this ramp, because you have to have a way to get up in there.
Danette, I have another question.
Please.
One of the things that I think is confusing also, granted it's the property owner that shares the lion's share of the responsibility on this. But if you're a business that's leasing, you also have some liability in that as well, correct?
Yes, it gets very sticky. So if I was a property owner of a brand new property, first off, you can imagine I'm going to make sure this thing is compliant, right? But let's say, for example, I want to purchase a property, it's all empty. I'm going to go through, it's my responsibility as the landlord to make sure that I have compliant parking, compliant access and travel, okay, compliant entrances, and compliant spaces inside. Now, I know whoever rents the space is going to come in and gut it anyways, probably, right? But the plumbing is probably going to stay about where the plumbing's at. So I need to make sure that if every one of these, let's say I have 10 suites, I'm going to make sure every one of those 10 suites has the one accessible bathroom that it should have, for example, and it's completely compliant. And all the plumbing fixtures are there. So unless you want to really start gutting, which I'm not going to let you do, those plumbing fixtures are going to stay right in that space. So I need to make sure we have the bathroom, the toilet, plumbing for the toilet, the plumbing for the sink with enough space in between, which I'll show you in a moment. So I'm going to make sure that's there. And then when you come to rent from me, I'm going to say, this is a compliant property. You can do what you want on the inside, but you cannot change the compliance aspect. So if The bathroom, if you want to like redo anything in the bathroom, that's fine. Put in a new toilet, put in a new sink. I don't care. However, it has to be compliant. I've already documented that it's compliant. I have pictures showing it's compliant. You have a responsibility as my tenant, and because it's the law, to keep it compliant. So now all of this, by the way, is in my lease agreement with you. So if somebody comes in and they come into your property and they say your bathroom isn't compliant, and you go, you know what, this isn't really my bathroom. This belongs to the landlord. Well, wait a second here, because I showed right here, this is what I had. And I said specifically, the sink is a perfect example. Because, again, we've got our plumbing fixtures for the toilet and our sink. You're probably not going to mess with those. However, I have a compliant sink in there that allows me to have access underneath the sink. And you come in with this really neat pedestal sink that's beautiful, but a person can't roll up underneath there. Whose responsibility is that? The landlord or the tenant? The tenant changed it, even though it was specifically on the lease agreement that you must maintain compliance. But you can imagine then that those people who, for example, are looking to sue, or they who have truly legitimate complaints, they are, by the way, suing the landlord and the tenant, both. It gets very, very sticky. You have a question, then Leah does.
Good morning. Now, could you go back to that slide where you added the additional parking?
Yes. Oh, wait, wrong way. There we
So
go.
you put a path of travel behind, or at the rear of the parking stall. Now, don't you open up a whole new can of worms by doing that? Because there are minimum setbacks when you have traffic flowing through the area like that. So you're putting them essentially in the path of traffic. So what would be the setback? What is the legal standard? That's my
Well,
first question.
Mhm.
And then secondly, some of your slides, I know that you also have to have wheel stops in handicap parking spots. So what I haven't seen is the minimum setback for that. I know that there's also a legal standard for that. So if you could just clarify that for everyone, please.
I'm going to say on the second one, on the wheel stops, I don't know exactly where that's required. And in some cases, I would say in some cases, your city also may have its own standard. What I can tell you in this case, we would never recommend this unless it was the only option. This building was built in probably the 1950s. The sidewalk is, would you say 2.5, maybe 3 feet, max 3 feet. So if you have max 3 feet, there's no way you can get a curb cut that goes from this part of the access aisle up onto that 3-foot sidewalk, and the building is right there. I mean, it's not even like there's sidewalk and then there's bushes, because we're going to rip those out. This is sidewalk and a big giant building right there. There was no getting around it. So we would not recommend this otherwise, but in this particular case, it was the only option that was feasible.
Now, with that being the only option, did that meet the requirements for the spacing in between? Because I can't ever get a clear answer from anyone, whether it be from the cities, counties, or whatever. But my understanding is that it has to be 25 feet.
You mean you're talking like this here?
Correct. Yes.
I have to say, I don't know.
See, this is there's
yeah.
so many gray areas with this.
There absolutely are. And in some cases, there's areas where this particular requirement kind of butts up with this particular requirement.
Well,
And it's unfortunate. And that's where, again, work directly with your city on these other requirements here. I know that in terms of access, this was the only option that they had.
So, just a quick background, I'm a licensed paving contractor out of the state of California. I work here in Arizona now, and in California, the standard is 25 feet. So
Okay.
if you're on the West Coast, you just go by the West Coast standard, which is LA. California, East Coast would be New York City, state of New York. So if you do that, you should probably be in.
And I also want to throw in that the city of Chandler has been very progressive about this. Not only do they have engineers that will help you work with this, and they're not here to slap your hands because you're not compliant. They're here to be business friendly. Not only do they have engineers, and that's where Warren's background is as well, but I'm also going to toot Leah's horn as well, because they also have certified ADA compliant people on staff. So these are free resources from the city,
Yes.
free from them, that can help you with that.
Absolutely.
If you need more extensive, that's when you've got to hire Nanette. So anyway, we have another question
But
here.
the start piece, that's the biggest piece, is just you guys being here. First off, I want to commend you for that. The fact that you're here and that you want to learn more about this is fantastic. And then again, be empowered to learn more. Yes, sir.
Okay, one more quick question on the landing. What is the minimum width of the landing area for the curb cut?
Let me show you right here. Yeah, a minimum of 5 feet. But what you're looking at here is when you're coming up right there, the depth of this is going to be based on how high that curb is.
Right.
So consider for every inch up you go, you have to have a full foot out. Does that make sense there? So if you have a really high sidewalk, a 6-foot sidewalk, for example, or 6-inch sidewalk right here, then you have to have 6 feet going straight out. But you need to have, right here, you need to have 36 inches because that would be the path someone from here to here would be traveling also.
Thank you.
Now,
Yes.
now for his question, you're talking about the running slope on the ramp being the max of 8.33%, right?
Yes.
For the foot, okay.
Yes.
And then the flares are 1 in 10?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So 1 in 12 or 1 in 10. And that gets a little bit sticky. And if we use a smart level, that can be really helpful. But again, if you just keep in mind that, for example, curb ramp itself, you're looking at for every inch up, you're looking at a full foot out. If you kind of keep that, that's a pretty easy way. It's a simple way. We'll talk a little bit about how it's a lot, here it is right here. It's a whole lot more complicated than what we've already described. So you can see right here, you're looking at 8.33% max here. You're looking at the 10% flare here. You're looking at these buffer areas. You've got this landing. Again, right here, you're looking at a 5% max. There's a lot of details. There's a lot of slope stuff to consider. But you know what? Don't let this give you a migraine. We really want to show you, number one, again, being here, going out, starting to measure, and then take a look beyond that, and you've got some fantastic experts that can also assist you. But at least get started. That's a big piece of it. So we want to continue on to accessible routes because now I've parked, I've got this beautiful parking. However, there's these really big metal and concrete garbage cans that are between the pillars and the buildings. And so I have to maneuver in and out of this altogether. That becomes an issue, right? So think in terms of even where are you going to place your big concrete garbage cans in different areas. Make sure that you have that accessible path through. This is an interesting one here. You can see that. We've got a little curb ramp here. Number one, it comes out into the parking space. Number two, it goes right up into a pillar. That doesn't make any sense at all. There's a whole website called Curb Ramps from Hell or something like that. Again, this is an issue. You can see right here, there's where they've got their parking bricks. And again, I'm glad you have that specifics. But you need to make sure that even if you have these things along the side, there still needs to be this accessible path to get in front of all this stuff and then be able to get into your building. That was a duplicate. Sorry about that. These are all pictures from Curb Ramps from Hell. You can see just a lot of really interesting things here. We do not recommend any of this at all right? Okay, in terms of goods and services, that's, again, one of the priorities. And one of the things we want to point out is this includes everything. So towel racks, hair dryers, cosmetic mirrors, closet bars. This is kind of related right here related to hotels. But you can see it really includes everything. You got to remember that we're talking about making sure that you have a good reach range. So having things that are really high, especially if there's a really deep shelf, really high is not going to work. You want to make sure you consider that. Make sure that if you're looking at different features that you have the lower features optioned. As much as possible, making sure you have a forward reach is very helpful. Again, you can see in this particular case, that's pretty high. And you know what? And that's in many cases, that's just embarrassing for a person not to be able to see the other person. You can see, again, right here. Now, what's interesting is you can see there's a lower counter. But what we oftentimes see is we see the lower counter because they're supposed to. But number one, it's way over in a corner where no one really sees it. And number two, they put their magazine racks or their water dispensers on it. That's not the intent of the law at all, okay? A little curb like this, just even a little bit of an edge right there as an entrance can make it different for a person who's in a wheelchair. These are some of the things that we've recommended, for example, is, everybody kind of wonders how do we do some kind of an ironing board. There's products out there that can be helpful, but there's a lot of details. These measurements, by the way, they really do matter. So there's measurements, all sorts of measurements, even related to where is the toilet paper dispenser supposed to be. I've heard of lawsuits where they actually came in and they were suing this retail chain because the retail chain did not have the center of its toilet paper dispenser between 7 and 9 inches of the edge of the toilet. That's someone going in with a tape measure looking for a reason to sue a company, and unfortunately, they've caused a bit of havoc with that. And by the way, we're not saying that's not important, okay? This is important. Imagine for a moment that you need to reach for the toilet paper, but it's way, way, way forward. That's a problem, right? Or I've seen cases where it's way behind me, and it's also difficult to reach. So by no means am I saying that these measurements aren't important, because they absolutely are. I want to point out that this is here for a reason, and there's a lot of research that goes into determining what these measurements are. But this is how detailed it can get, and this is one of the reasons why it's helpful to just start taking a look at this stuff. That's a minor thing. I've given you kind of a quick overview of a bathroom. This is like a single-user bathroom, and there's so many requirements that aren't even shown here in regards to How much space do you need to get in? How much turn radius do you need to have? Getting to the sink, getting to the toilet. One of the reasons why this space right here is important is so that a person could maybe back their wheelchair in and then they can slide over to the toilet. That's the reason why the grab bars have to be at a certain place. Again, this was not random selection. This was people really researching what is going to be the most optimal way for a person who needs to transfer to be able to do so given the required features. So you have those. You have, again, the grab bars, whether it's pull handles like for a stall. I want everybody to, when you get back to your place of business, I want you to go in with a closed fist and see, can you open the doors? If you have knob doors, you probably cannot. If you have knob doors, you need to replace them with these types of things. Think about your faucets and your sinks, okay? It really needs to be a lever faucet. It needs to be level handles. Again, closed fist is going to be really helpful for you to become just more aware of what you need to do. And you know what? Even those simple things, I see in many cases, there's things that could easily be fixed. And people go, we're going to be getting to that. That's in our plan. But you know what? You can fix that tomorrow. And you can fix that tomorrow. So do what you can to fix what you can right now, and then continue with the rest of it. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I want to point out there's a large hotel organization that was very concerned about the pool lift requirements. They went to the Department of Justice, really lobbied in D.C., and I want to read to you kind of what their response was back. Developing plans to meet their ongoing barrier removal obligations is a requirement, okay? Such a plan, if appropriately designed and diligently executed, may serve well as evidence of good faith effort. So in some cases, I've seen many organizations, and they have what they call a transition plan. Now, a transition plan essentially says, this is where you're at. You're evaluating your level of compliance. This is where you're at. Department of Justice says this is where you need to be. Transition plan says this is how I'm going to get there. Does that make sense? So if you develop a plan and you diligently execute it, this isn't we did it, and isn't it beautiful? And nobody touches it, and it gathers dust. You think you're going to be able to defend that in court? Probably not. So this is where you evaluate and you start making some efforts. So one of the things that we did was, I've been in the field for, well, I've lived and or worked with people with disabilities literally my entire life. And I am just almost obsessed with the ADA and all of this. And I found myself in too many cases where, again, people said, we're going to do that. It's on our plan for next year or 2 years. It's on our 3-year plan. But you know what? You can go out and do that right now. There are some things you can do. So what we did was I put together, this is not the Department of Justice, this is me, okay? So this transition plan that we're talking about, let me go back real quick. What I did was I came up with this idea that if you do like a 5, think about like 5-star rating, okay? So a 5, for example, is compliant, okay? If you've got a 5, you're compliant. A 4 would be you're not compliant, but it's a really easy thing like changing out the handles or changing the hardware or putting up the correct sign. A 3 in a situation of a parking lot would be maybe restriping the parking lot, okay? It's a little bit more complicated. A 2, it's not compliant, but now you're actually going to have to like resurface because you have some slope issues. A 1 is technically infeasible. We have a lot of people who go, but it's technically infeasible, right? Right? And we go, no, you can do this. No, it's technically infeasible. No, I've got some ways that you can do this. Shoot. They want to be technically infeasible in some cases because they realize there's going to be some expense. There are tax incentives we'll talk about, but the thing I want to point out is we've put this together because I wanted to come up with a way that I could say, okay, we're going to come out and we're going to measure everything. This is what my company does, my husband and I, and we have a bunch of wonderful teams that do this. So we'll come out and we measure everything, and we take thousands of pictures in some cases, okay? And then you get a report. And your report is going to show you specifically where you're at here. It's going to show you these specifics. It's going to show you specifics in terms of some of the things that we found. And again, what you're going to see here is, you're going to see, for example, here is a rating of a 4. This is a fairly easy fix. This is a 4. You're just going to change out, for example, on your curtain rods, you're going to change them to something that would be easy to maneuver if you needed a closed fist, or if you weren't able to operate with your hands. A 5, well, we've got here, this is compliant. Now, this is not compliant, right? This is a 4. The reason this is a 4 is because I could probably change out a doorknob. We wouldn't want me to, but I could probably do that with some instructions or YouTube. So a 4 is going to be something that you can do right away. And we want you to see that because we want you to see that you can be empowered to just go out and start making some changes immediately. Again, in the case where we have a 3 right here, we had a sink, and the sink went down too low. It's not going to be easy. It's not that it's impossible, but it's not going to be as easy to completely replace this sink, or in some cases to actually saw cut up into here. This was a 2. This was where the door itself, there was simply not enough space, and they're actually going to have to expand the door. So does it make sense, this sort of rating that I have? Again, 5-star rating, so 5 would be compliant. The higher your numbers are, the better off you are. A 4 would be it's a real easy fix. You can do it this weekend. A 3 would be it's a little more complicated. You need a plan for that. A 2 is you're going to have to start budgeting. And a 1, we rarely ever assign a 1. Okay? But this is some of the things. Yes?
I just wanted to just add something. I'm a dentist just north of here, and I don't know much about this at all, but this is unsolicited. Nanette really knows her stuff. She's worth the consultation with her husband coming out, and she was very reasonable with fees. Leah at the city was great. They're right. It's free.
Yeah.
And then Hawkeye Striping, restripe my parking lot.
Yeah.
Nanette gave me his name. If you want to write his name down, too, it's 480-797-3273. Hawkeye Striping is really good. But like I said, this is unsolicited. She's worth it. She knows her stuff. It's intimidating as heck, but at least you know where you're at.
I think we were out there on 4th of July, weren't we? I think it was 4th of July. We had almost an...
Nice little letter. It's very, well, as a dentist.
Well, and yours, yeah, and yours was a little different because we had kind of done yours in a different way, but this is essentially what a report will look like, is you can see, and you can see this is like a summary, so you can look right down the list, and you look at this and you're like, okay, I'm going to just ignore all these 5s because, whoo, I've got a lot of 5s there. You go, okay, I got a 4. What can I do immediately? And then I've got a couple 3s. What can I do? So this will give you, you'll have this full report that will show you in this particular hotel room and their tub, this is where they were at. And so you can really quickly see, and you have a summary at the bottom of your report. And it's interesting, in the particular case where we were out there 4th of July, we had a couple teams working really hard at a golf resort. And what had happened was they had gotten a warning letter, and the letter essentially said, we're going to be out there next week, and if we find your parking lot isn't compliant, we're going to search the rest of your property. You do not want that to happen, okay? Now, not that you want to be compliant, but you don't want someone to come and search your property. That sounds a little intimidating, and it is. So they contacted us. We went out immediately, started making recommendations for their parking lot. We then scheduled to come back out and do their entire golf resort. And while we were there doing their entire golf resort, they already had their striper there already working on the parking lot on 4th of July. They got the whole parking lot done, and then when this, and we put this report out fast, okay? So that's one of the things, too, is that when we gather all of this data, we have all this data, and it may be in its raw form to send you a sort of an emergency, here's your document, but we get this thing cleaned up and we make it something that's very manageable. But in this particular case, we just sent them this document as quick as we could, so they had it on site. And what ended up happening was the company came through, they saw the parking lot, it was perfectly compliant, and they left. And they probably saved at least $7,500 in lawsuits, in just settlement fees right there, because that piece right there was compliant. Now, I want to point out that it doesn't stop at the parking lot, okay? There's a whole lot of other things. When the pool lifts, about a year ago, pool lifts were really big. And everybody had a hotel was being sued for pool lifts. What was happening was a person would call up and say, do you have a pool lift? Or do you have a pool? Yes, we do. Do you have a pool lift? No. Click. Okay. Yes, we have a pool lift. Okay, wonderful. If I come to your hotel, is the battery in the pool lift or is it in the lobby? Oh, no, you come up to the registration desk and we will come out there. Click. They'd all have a lawsuit within a week. So you can imagine the hotels were just really struggling with trying to figure out how can we quickly fix this. So I would have companies or properties that would call us out, and they would say, just walk right through the lobby, go right out to the pool. So we would do that, and I would count 10 things without even trying. I'd find like 5 to 10 things in the lobby alone in the parking lot coming in that were not compliant. So I know that everybody's been really pretty scared about what's been happening with parking lots and pool lifts, but please let me tell you that it goes beyond parking lots and pool lifts, and it comes down to requirements regardless. And so if you're not compliant, these are some things you need to do. Dale, you take care. So these are some things you need to do, and you need to understand that there are tax credits that can assist you. So I want to go through this real quick. Businesses can take advantage of 2 federal tax incentives available to help cover costs of making accessible improvements for customers with disabilities. There's a tax credit for small businesses who remove access barriers from their facilities, provide accessible services, or take other steps to improve accessibility for customers with disabilities. Okay? That's the credit. And then you have the deduction of all sizes that remove access barriers in their facilities or vehicles. And so again, this is an annual, okay, a business that incurs annually incurs eligible expenses to bring itself into compliance with the ADA may use these tax incentives every single year. So there's an example here I wanted you guys to see because it gets a little bit confusing. So Hotel ABC, for example, they spent $20,000 on access improvements by modifying their guest rooms and their front entrance. These expenditures qualify under both the tax credit and deduction. So ABC Hotel can use these incentives in combination. They may first take a tax credit of $5,000 based on a $10,250 of expenditures. You get like half of it or something. And then they deduct $15,000, the difference between these on their credits. So I'm not a tax person, but I want you guys to see this, and I want you to talk to your own people about this because there's some real incentives that can be helpful to you. The last thing I want to show you is this, and I absolutely love this cartoon, and I think this really shows the spirit of the law. So you have a cartoon, if you can't see this or overall. What you have here is it looks like a school, and you have a bunch of kids, and they're waiting to get up into the school. And there's a gentleman who is shoveling the snow. And over to the left, there is a ramp, and over to the right, there is steps. And the kid who's in a wheelchair at the bottom of the ramp says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the gentleman who's shoveling says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." And the kid says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." So I hope some light bulbs are going off. When we create a more accessible environment, we're creating a better environment for everybody, okay? So I want you to think about that, not just in terms of it's the law, I might get sued, I'm going to have settlement fees, how much is this going to cost me? But I want you to think about people that you know that maybe have disabilities, or some point in their lives you or they may have a disability. And I want you to think in terms of them being able to park and get up into your business, for example. So I hope that this has been helpful. We're available if you have any questions at all. And again, I want to just commend you guys for being here and showing an interest in this, and then hopefully proactively making some changes to make improvements.
Let's give Nanette a round of applause. Warren or Leah from the city, do you want to add anything from the city's perspective? Not to put you on the spot, but I am.
Yeah, I'm Warren White with the City of Chandler, and these are sometimes difficult and challenging questions that require a little bit of research, but if you do have any questions, we've received a lot of calls over the past few months. Often that leads to sending out information from the DOJ, or there's a striping brochure that's been helpful that I've shared a few times, and often getting with other departments in the city for questions. Leah being the past ADA coordinator, she's always there as a resource. But again, be able to share my contact information. As a city, we're in the midst of this as well. We have our transition plan. And in fact, this afternoon we're going to be at Center for the Arts doing an interior assessment, looking at bathrooms.
Yeah, so if you come in and you find we're all in there with bathrooms and tape measures and notepads and stuff, that's what we're doing.
We've already looked
Come
at
watch.
the parking lot a few weeks ago, and a month ago, I guess.
Yeah.
And we have upgrades planned for that. The city's been out updating our signs as well. Just like everywhere you look, as you become aware of this, you realize a lot of signs are too low just because of the history and the changes in the law.
Exactly.
But that's what I'd like to say. Thanks.
There's a lot of great resources out there, a lot of great resources online.
So I was curious, either one of you could probably answer this question, because municipalities can add to the already existing ADA law. Obviously, they can't take away from it because the federal standards are basically the baseline. What additions has the city of Chandler added to the ADA regulations that goes above and beyond what the federal regulations are? Thank you.
Sure. Above and beyond would be, instead of the 8-foot minimum stall width, city standard is 9 foot. So that applies to all parking lots. I think that's just a little wider space. I've noticed many, like in parks, I think we use 11 foot wide in general, so it's a wider space.
know the city of Phoenix, spaces are all required to be 11 foot.
I noticed in Phoenix, there is a height restriction too. The 60 inches minimum, they have a maximum of 72, by the way.
Yeah,
That would not go with my recommendation, but that's okay because they trump that.
Right.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
so that's why I want to know
understand.
Oh, yeah.
what kind of things in the city of Chandler are unique, because we deal with stuff all over the valley, and it's hard to keep all of that.
I've heard from other striping companies calling, saying, well, you know, the city of Phoenix does it this way, Tempe does it that way. Yeah, I understand. For the most part, the city, our zoning code states the requirements, and it mimics the ADA standards, other than the 9 foot. And then the state requirement says you must paint the symbol in the stall, versus ADA says you don't. That's
ADA
what-
says you don't have to, but everybody does, and we want you to.
Yeah.
And if you do paint it down at the end. So you're not going to necessarily paint it in the middle of the stall. You're going to paint it at the end, so like right where the approach is at. If your vehicle's here, your sign is at the end. And the reason I've been told that they do that is so that it's real easy for someone to see. Like if there's a question of you're parked in an accessible parking space, but you don't have a placard or plate, it's real easy to see. You couldn't have gone in there without seeing that symbol. So I've heard for enforcement that's helpful, but it's,
And I've heard on enforcement, I think in the law says if you have 4 or fewer spaces, you're not technically required to have a sign.
well, that's for a few total spaces, like, and it's not accessible spaces. If you only have if you have 3 parking spaces in your entire parking lot, you don't necessarily have to have accessible parking.
They have to be compliant, but they don't have to have a sign.
Right, right.
But on the other hand, I heard the other day that that in order for police to enforce it, there has to be a sign with the ARS on it. So those are those nuances.
Okay, is there anything else that Nanette may not have covered that you're questioning on your property or a neighbor's property or a made-up property? So that
Everything's hypothetical.
Okay, I've got a facility that is, it's got 3 tenants. One company occupies probably 3/4 of the building.
Okay,
They've got access points into that into that company,
okay,
front and back.
okay.
They're required to meet ADA requirements for parking spaces, both front and back.
They have parking for the public in the front and the back. Oh, well, I would say probably yes.
Public parking is in the back. I mean, is in the front.
Okay, and the parking in the back,
would be for more for employees, deliveries, that kind of thing.
that,
Still have to be compliant for if you have employees who are.
right, Title I. Yeah, Title I says you still need to have that. We've seen many cases like that where the back is only employee parking, and it's, again, it's essentially not storage, but shipping. If the public could park there, let's say, for example, the front lot is completely overflowed, you're full, people are going to park in the back, I would recommend you have at least one back there. But also consider, one of the things the ADA also talks about is that if you have multiple parking lots that serve one building, those parking lots need to have accessible parking. I've seen, there's one particular place I know of, I don't agree with it, I've already advised against it. They have thousands of parking spaces. This is a big place. Thousands of parking spaces. They do not have accessible parking all around here. They have one entire lot that is accessible parking. Now, the intent was very good, but the problem is this. If this is my accessible parking lot right here, and everything here is full because there's the building, and you have to park over there, and now you have to take your wheelchair or scooter, and you have to go in and out and weave through all of these vehicles that are maybe high-profile vehicles, and you're maybe lower in a chair, of course, that's, in my opinion, dangerous. My preference would be to have accessible parking that goes all the way around that building right up close by, not necessarily designate an entire lot. The law supports that, having accessible parking at various locations with equal access to accessible entrances. So,
I also want to do another shout out. I know that the city has currently adapted a new adaptive reuse policy. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And Warren and Leah, jump in at any time. This is taking older parts, older buildings, or older parts of the city. There's certain areas that the city is encouraging that if it's been vacant or turning houses into, restaurants or whatever the case may be. An older building and repurposing it, kind of, so to say. With that being said, the city has used to be called the Small Business Assistance Team. It's now it's an economic development. It's a team of city people that will come out. It will be your fire marshal. It will be somebody from planning and the building codes and so forth. It'll be, I call it the super team. This is a free service that the city will come out. They'll all have what signage look like, what are all of these components look like. And I think that it's really important before you either purchase that building or lease that building to be able to take a look at what's going to be compliant in there. And again, these are in adapting all of these things that you've learned today, I think is really important. Not all communities have that, and I think that that's really important to say because Chandler has been very progressive. What other entity partners with the city and somebody like Nanette to come in and really talk about these issues? And they're not trying to slap your hands. They're really trying to. And I know that in some of the businesses that I've spoke to regarding that have been hit with either the warning letters or the lawsuits, it's not that they don't want to be compliant. They just didn't know. Yeah. And that's the key thing. So I just want to thank you for being here. You are a fountain of knowledge. So let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you, guys.
And I know that Leah and Warren are here to answer any questions, and if you have any
Absolutely.
questions directly, and thank you for being here.